Yeah, thanks for coming to this workshop. I'm Susanne Martike, and I work at the Greater Manchester Centre for Voluntary Organisation, and I do research there and also host the Greater Manchester Third Sector Research Network, which is a big name for us for a little network that brings together people who are interested or who are actively interested in doing research in and about the VCS. So a few of us have actually been asked to do this presentation today to give a flavor of what it's like to do research in practice. And so I will first do a little bit of an introduction about the topic in general, and then I'll hand over to my colleagues who will give you specific examples of what they've done. So I just first wanted to clarify what we're going to talk about here, because I mean research in the voluntary sector is a very wide term and a very wide field. So we're not concerned about research about the third sector at the moment, and we're also not concerned about research that generally just happens to take place in the voluntary sector. But we're specifically interested in research that helps voluntary sector organizations to operate, yeah, so that is closely connected to their operations. The other thing I wanted to clarify is what do we mean by VCS, and why did we pick this term? Organizations that have that are neither the state nor the private nor part of the private market have received a lot of labels, but we picked voluntary and community sector, VCS in short, because it's usually used to refer to organizations that are a bit more local and that are not like the big charities, like you know, the well-known ones like Oxfam or so. So that's also very important to keep in mind. Oh yeah, good, thanks. So first of all, what is special about this VCS, and what are the characteristics? So, I mean, this again is a topic that I could talk about for a long time, but I'm just going to focus on a couple of issues that, or characteristics that I think, and we actually collectively thought influence what type of research is possible. So, initially, it's basically the fact that VCS organizations often have a focus on social justice, and that probably comes from the fact that many of them actually formed in response to perceived social injustices, gaps in service provision, and things like that. And it's actually a fact that a third of the voluntary sector workforce overall is engaged in social welfare, so or in social work. So the other distinction from other sectors is that there's volunteer involvement. So in addition to paid staff, there's a lot of reliance on volunteers. And of course, as we talk about the VCS, there are lots of smaller organizations, and there the reliance on volunteers will be particularly heavy. In terms of paid staff, there is a prevalence of part-time staff rather than full-time staff. So that in turn, you know, influences organizations' capacity with regard to their work, but also with regard to research. In terms of income, there is a trend. More and more organizations actually do, you know, raise their own income. They do trading to earn income. But that's still comparatively small to the voluntary income, which is grants, legacies, and donations. So even if an organization is aiming to make profit, if it's part of the VCS, it'll be profit in order to fund the social goal. But usually, I mean, it's not established to make profit. The other thing I wanted to mention, yeah, it's just the small size of these organizations. So again, to highlight the lack of capacity. So why would you do research in the VCS? Why would VCS organizations engage in this? And there are many reasons, but there are definitely 3 reasons that come up again and again and that are very important. And the first is about evidence of need. So if organizations want to attract funding for a program or for a service, they need to first demonstrate that there is a need for that service. So then the second one is about evidence of impact. So funders that have funded the work want to know what difference has it made and was that actually a good investment. And the third one is sort of related to that, and that's about what works and what doesn't, which points to the fact that obviously it's about, it should be about constant learning and, adapting services to actually reflect what has been proven to work and what hasn't. So, and more broadly speaking, organizations are interested in how society is changing and how what different populations, different demographics might need that the state can provide and that the private economy won't provide. So, and then this evidence may also be used for campaigning. So campaigning on behalf of service users or constituencies, and ultimately for marketing. So what does this mean for research? I think you've already probably caught my drift, but it's very much, it is a very goal-oriented process. So it's not so much about actually building knowledge or developing theory or anything. It is very much about who wants to know and what do they want to know and why. So, and a lot of it is really about monitoring and evaluation. So you sort of hope that the service is actually doing a good job and is having a good impact. And so that could, in research terms, I guess that could be a hypothesis, and then you would set about proving that. And then that information is packaged for funders, and hopefully the negative aspects or the things that aren't working is retained for internal learning. There is a lot of research, what I would call with a small r, which is about looking at census statistics and stuff like that. Data that's easily accessible and quite, easier to use than some of the big open data that you have now, which is about what I spoke about earlier, trying to find out what's actually needed, what are the demographics in a certain area or so. And the same is, and the point is that this actually has to be free, so it's usually not possible for organizations to actually pay for data. I know there's lots of available data which is free, but you also need the skills to actually, analyze that. So I think in my experience, it's quite common to use census data. The same goes actually for, for articles, like journal articles or so. They're not typically accessible for voluntary organizations unless they're willing to pay for them. So they might decide to subscribe to a journal that's part of, that talks about their topic area, but I think that's maybe not so common. Because it's all about resources and actually being able to pay for that. What is very important to keep in mind is that research needs to, it needs to basically not only take account of the fact that organizations are not specifically funded to do research, so they don't typically have the money to do it, and also that their main aim is actually usually service delivery. So it can't really interfere with the aim of delivering the service. So you would like to, you would employ methods that don't interfere with that, but maybe add to that. So very, very popular methods in the voluntary sector are interviews, but those, if they're used, they would not be usually, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think usually not recorded and transcribed because it's just too much work and it's not possible. Focus groups are quite popular as a quick way of accessing a lot of different opinions. Surveys as well, even though I think mostly the analysis will be descriptive rather than statistical. I think there is a organizations tend to be sympathetic to participatory methods as well. And this goes back to the whole idea that they have a social justice agenda. Yeah, I'm done. So, yeah, and to get more, my colleagues are going to give you a bit more detail now and yeah, tell you what that actually looks like in practice.
So hi everyone, my name is Heidi Koljonen and I'm going to talk to you very, very briefly about the challenges of using standardized music therapy assessment forms to evaluate a music therapy project for people with dementia. So before I move on to talk about the actual method that I use to collect data during the evaluation, I'll just give you a very brief introduction to the project itself. Music in Mind is a music therapy initiative for people with dementia. It's run by Mashiter, and most of the sessions are delivered in residential care home settings, and the delivery format that they employ is very creative, improvisation-based approach to music therapy to kind of make sure that they respond to the client's various needs. As some of you might know, evaluation is all about assessing the outputs, outcomes and impact of a project and then comparing those to the initial aims and objectives to kind of draw conclusions about the effectiveness of the activities. So this was a very, very typical evaluation. We were asked to look at the impact that the Music in Mind sessions were having on the participants' quality of life and well-being. The audience for the evaluation report, which I think is quite typical for any evaluation, included the funding bodies, both the internal and external delivery partners, and then potential future stakeholders, mainly those local authorities that had not already engaged with the organisation or with the project. Right, so, excuse me. I've been working on the Music in Mind evaluations for around 18 months. Each Music in Mind project lasts between 10 and 20 weeks. And in the past, I'd mainly used qualitative methods such as diaries, questionnaires and interviews, mainly interviews, I think. Those were chosen because they were most suited to the participants' needs, but also they were a good way of capturing the kind of soft outcomes that we were dealing with, such as changes in behaviours and moods and thoughts and personal development and learning. For this particular evaluation, we got a request to try to quantify some of the emotional and physical well-being that we had witnessed during the previous evaluations. And this is what I find is quite common in evaluation, that you get requests from either funding bodies or clients to present data in a very specific format and focus on only certain types of data. So I hope you can't probably see properly, but so the music therapy assessment forms, this is like a standardized form used to assess music therapy activities, was divided in two sections. So we had the rating scale in the middle that we were hoping would help us to quantify the softer outcomes. And then we added a comment box at the bottom for additional kind of thoughts and observations. We didn't have very high hopes for the comment box because we knew that the carers that we asked to keep these, or we asked to record the behaviours, they were incredibly busy. So we thought that we're not going to get much in that section. Right, but we were very wrong. Here in the left-hand, the top corner. So that kind of presents a typical entry for the rating scale box. As you can see, there's not that many changes there, and it didn't provide us the data that we were hoping to get. Each week looked pretty much the same for each participant. There wasn't any notable changes in moods or behaviours or interaction or musical kind of development. And we thought, well, that's very strange because it doesn't seem to represent the feedback that we've heard from the musicians and the participants. I mean, those participants that weren't asked to keep the forms. Then what really surprised us, that it was the comment box at the bottom that the participants had used quite extensively to record various thoughts and behaviours and abilities that they've witnessed throughout the 10-week period. And then we were able to use the data in the comment boxes to start kind of tracking the client's music in mind, kind of like a journey. And we were also able to use that to quantify some of the outcomes, not to the extent that we would have liked to, but at least we had something, and then we could back them up with the case studies and comments from the carers. So just quick, what did I learn from this? The quantitative section, yeah, like I said before, it didn't provide us the kind of data that we were looking for in this instance, but it provided excellent material for interviews, because obviously I wanted to understand more about the way the carers had used the rating scale and why the scale section was a representative of the comments in the comment boxes. The carers did not find the rating scale section valuable. They didn't understand the value of it. They didn't feel like it captured the complexity of dementia. And if you don't value something, you're not going to put a lot of time and effort into it. They were more comfortable with completing the comment boxes because they felt like they had the opportunity to express their personal observations in their own words, and that was incredibly important to them. So the comment boxes, or the qualitative section of the form, was really good for tracking weekly progress, like I just shown you, and it also provided good material for interviews. The only downside to it was that it was very time-consuming for the participants. They work in a very bureaucratic environment, and they have to fill out incredible amounts of paperwork every single day. So this just kind of added to that load. The sessions run on a weekly basis, and they were given half an hour after each session to complete the form. So that's something that have to be considered in the future. Would I use them again? I did think about this question quite some time, and I realised that sometimes I think in evaluation it's not up to me to decide what methods we use. I think the decision is kind of guided by and driven by so many different external factors. In evaluation, you quite rarely get to know your participants beforehand. You have no idea who you're dealing with. You don't know anything about their skills and abilities. You don't even know who's going to be there on the day. You don't know much about the delivery environment always. So I think, yeah, I think we managed to collect all the data that we wanted with this particular method, but would I use them again? That I think depends on the next project that I'll be working on. Thank you.
The project I want to talk to you about here is from yet a previous job. That was with the Manchester Local Involvement Network. So a network of local people and organisations who at the time were trying to involve service users, Manchester residents, in health and social care services, and has since been replaced by Manchester Health Watch. So the project, well, what I want to talk to you about really is kind of using participatory research, but I use that term in the widest possible sense. So we didn't necessarily use it as stringently as you might do for in an academic setting, because it was part of a wider organizational context and work. So if we move on to the next slide, the purpose of the project, and I purposefully called it a project rather than the purpose of the research, wasn't just to find out information and to kind of get data and a better understanding, but it was to really make a change in Manchester. So first and foremost, what we wanted to do was we wanted to embed dignity and respect in health and social care in Manchester. And we had a whole campaign around that with various different projects and work streams. Also, really importantly, everything we did was about involving our key stakeholders in all stages of the process, in all stages of decision making, and also carrying out work. And when I talk about our key stakeholders, first and foremost, obviously service users of health and social care, the wider public, and then service providers and commissioners. And we're keen to always work in partnership to identify issues and solutions in order to already build in a greater capacity for that change to happen. And again, in that context of working with different stakeholders, we were specifically interested in amplifying the voices of those who are generally more marginalized or more seldom heard, so service users. And all this information was then also fed into the regulatory system, so fed back to the Care Quality Commission. We'll move on. So action research, I don't have time to cover sort of what it is, how it works in depth, but I think this quite famous quote by Valeska, that without knowledge, action is useless, and knowledge without action is futile, kind of exemplifies the whole idea behind it. It's not kind of research for research's sake, it's not action without kind of an understanding of theory or the wider context, it's a kind of combination of the two. And it works in sort of cycles. And different projects might just kind of go around one cycle and might go around 2 or 3, go on for, you know, several years or whatever, or you might just do part of a cycle. But roughly speaking, you kind of, you know, you plan some work, you do some work, you see what's gone on with that and reflect on it, and then from there you move on to kind of plan and act and reflect again. So with this particular project, just to kind of give you an idea of what that means in practice, we started with observations, I guess, so with feedback we were getting from the public about their experiences of health and social care services. Reflecting on those, we kind of identified that lots of people were talking about things that had to do with dignity and respect, with the way they were being treated by providing organizations, care staff. So then we planned a piece of work to kind of explore that further and decided at the time to focus our more in-depth exploration on home care, because at the time there was a lot of media attention on that issue. Then we went out and did an extra sort of research project where we gathered data from home care users or customers, depending on how you want to call that, as part of a tell us your story kind of project. So what I'm mainly talking about is going out and interviewing people, and we use some of our link members, so some of our stakeholders, to actually carry out those interviews as well. And then we looked at the data and analyzed it, so reflected again on what we were seeing, and identified that while there were lots of different issues, the key point was that when home care customers had issues, quite often they didn't have the means to address those because they were either afraid to complain because they feared reprisals from their providing agency, or they just didn't realize they could complain, or that they had a right to a better service. And were afraid that maybe what they had, even though it didn't work for them, was better than having nothing. So if they spoke out, there were some fears that services would be withdrawn. So on the basis of that, we decided that there was no point putting any kind of resource and time into writing this up as a nice little research report, but instead we used the information to develop a resource. So to develop information for home care customers on their rights and on ways of going about kind of addressing issues informally or complaining, to then empower them to get those issues that they might experience addressed. So then if you move on. And that means that as an end result, again, so I'm not really talking about findings per se, but about a wider end result, we did get this resource for Manchester that could be and has been adapted to other areas, but much more importantly for us, we ended up with better informed home care customers here in Manchester who felt more in control of the service they receive. And indeed, I had personal feedback from some of the people we worked with who went back to their home care provider and got some of the things that they were really struggling with much improved. We also had better informed home care providers and commissioners who kind of understood much better the experience of their customers that they were trying to provide services for and trying to provide a good quality service for. And we had much better links between all those different stakeholders. When we started, I think there was a lot of, I don't know, those relationships had kind of broken down, and there was a lot of mistrust between, say, the providers, the councils, or the commissioners, customers, pressure groups such as us who were working on behalf of customers. And through all working together and shaping this project together and carrying out together and developing that trust, we developed much greater capacity to then address other issues on the back of that, and other projects have come out of this. And also, those people who were directly involved in doing some of this planning and carrying out some of this research benefited from it by increasing their knowledge, their skills, their self-confidence. So I guess the point that I'm trying to make is that for me, or some of the work I do in the voluntary sector, while of course it is about kind of getting information and data and understanding an issue better to then potentially point out to somebody what the needs are, or to explain to somebody why what you're doing is important and has an impact, there are also lots of other outcomes that might be just as important. So in a way, or from my perspective, a lot of the times my work is much more process-driven than outcome-driven. And what you might get at the end, it might be very different to what you expected to get when you set out. And with that, there are some challenges that are also opportunities, depending on how you look at it and how you manage it. So there is a kind of lack of clear boundaries because you're making it up as you go along. But that does mean sometimes when you're working with a group of people that maybe, especially if there is an agreement as to the right way forward, that you kind of waste a lot of time or spend a lot of time on, I don't know, redefining what you're there to do and how you're going to work and kind of making the same decisions over and over again. Also, even though this is generally a methodology that tries to address power dynamics, they do still exist. You know, they are still there. And while it's nice to have all these stakeholders around the table, you can imagine that, you know, a commissioner might be able to influence the conversations much more than, say, an older person from one of the communities who receives home care or whose partner receives home care, so who's there on the basis of their own lived experience. And then again, I mean, kind of related to lack of clear boundaries, the more people you involve, the more opinions you've got. And there can be a risk that too many cooks spoil the broth, as the saying goes. And again, as I said, because it's more process-driven, that can be a challenge because it can also take quite a long time. And then the people who are engaged and who you're expecting quite a lot of kind of contribution from might lose motivation or might not quite see what the point of it all is. And this whole project, from us starting to talk about generally what was going on, identifying dignity and respect, going through it to then have the final resource published, took about 2 years. So you can see how somebody who does that on a voluntary basis might not want to stick around that long to then kind of see the outcome of it. I hope that's given you a little bit of an idea.
Hi, I'm Sue Lewis. I've been around in the voluntary sector for about 12 years, both at project delivery level and at board level, so a couple of different perspectives there. And as with most people in the voluntary sector, research makes up a grand total of 0 of my job description, but I do it anyway because I love it and because I believe it can have a real impact on the work that we do. So GMWN, our mission, I'm going to read it, it's really ill-prepared, but our mission is to generate positive experiences for young people through delivering creative choice of inspirational opportunities that encourage young people to participate. So we do a load of work across Greater Manchester we have funding that comes from loads of different funding streams, which can pull you in a number of different ways as a researcher. And we work throughout Greater Manchester, so obviously logistically it can be quite challenging when you actually completing research, because as we know, it's quite a challenge for young people to get out of their local area. So I also wanted to mention our leadership group. So our leadership group is at the heart of our governance model and feed into our board of trustees, which will become relevant as I go on through this mini presentation. So with GMWAN as an organisation, we aim to deliver with a needs-led approach. There is no point going out there and applying for loads of funding for something that the trustees or management or our CEO believe will be of benefit to young people, because at the end of the day, we're all a lot older than our beneficiary group, and sometimes those ideas can be a bit misinformed sometimes. So what we want to do and how we use research is to actually generate information that can then feed into our decision-making process about the direction that the organisation is going, what's needed out there, that we can create projects to apply for funding for, to actually address those issues. Okay, so with our leadership group worked with our Q-STEP students. So are you familiar with Q-STEP? Some of you in the room are. So Q-STEP is a national strategy around engaging younger university students with the research process and looking specifically at quantitative data. So we kind of bent the rules a little bit with this one and merged quantitative and quals, but I'll come on to that in a second. So our leadership group of young people and the Q-STEP student designed a consultation process with the purpose of exploring the views of young people from our projects all over the region to look, as I've mentioned earlier, about the issues facing young people, the awareness around support and services, the beneficial and enjoyable activities, and some of those practical barriers such as travel and transport, which start to shape what projects actually look like from an organisational perspective. And then, as I say, this information would later be used by the organisation to shape future projects. So the method, one of our key challenges engaging young people in any sort of research, which some of you might be familiar with, is actually gaining a reasonable response rate. Okay, it's not the most glamorous thing, asking a young person whilst they're doing loads of exciting stuff, because all of our projects are really exciting, can you just sit down and fill in this questionnaire, because it's not going to work. They will not do it, or they'll rush through it and you don't get any meaningful data. So reasonable response rate, making the process accessible and interesting, and ensuring young people actually feel comfortable enough within the environment that you're putting them in so that they're able to give an honest answer. Okay, so the leadership group and the Q-STEP student worked together under my supervision to design a youth work session. So we actually developed a session which included creative tasks that generated qualitative alongside quantitative data. One of the activities, for example, was an exercise where clouds were pinned around the room with the start of sentences, such as something that concerns me is, something that frightens me is, I love ... and young people were encouraged just to start opening up their ideas around their views around those things by putting post-its up around the room, just to start them thinking in that mindset. The team designed and delivered a training session to the youth workers. So our youth workers within our organisation were going to support this process. So they designed and delivered a training session to those youth workers and project staff around the concept that they created with the research, and gave them all the resources necessary to deliver the session, where they were supported by one of the young people who'd created the research process. The different elements of the session were all themed around the X Factor. At this point, I did want like the X Factor theme, but I thought, no, it's a bit patronising. So with everything from auditions, judges' houses, through to live shows, and the final, which added a competitive element where the young people had the chance to use actually the information and the ideas that they'd generated during this process and actually create something with them. So we asked them to create their ideal project, which added just that bit of extra. Obviously, that wasn't going to create an awful lot of useful data, but it was a way of actually rounding off the process for them as well, which I think as researchers, you're sometimes so fixed on what you're going to get out of it that you forget that actually the people involved can really gain something from the process as well. So we did that, and that was judged by the trustees and the CEO against criteria made by the young people themselves, which was the fun factor, the reality factor, so will the projects actually, could they exist in real life, not like flying to the moon, and the impact factor, so the impact that it would have for them as young people. So the findings, the data is being organised and analysed at the moment, but the initial findings suggest that a high proportion of young people actually feel anxious about their futures, particularly around education and finance and budget management. And there's also data that identifies a gap in the general light touch support for young people. Now this is really critical. I don't know how many people are familiar with the youth sector, but this could actually be a source of providing support for recognising the impact of the reduction of investment in youth services. So done on a wider level, that could actually be quite a powerful source of information. In terms of key learning, it was a really successful process for engaging a range of young beneficiaries from different backgrounds, and this was drawn out of the fact that actually we had over 60% higher participation rates than our general online consultation that GMYN actually sends out. So it was quite successful in terms of numbers. We had really positive evaluation from the youth workers and the volunteers who supported us to complete that process. I know sometimes when you're delivering a bit of research, like it's mine and I'm going to do it because I know how to do it, and if I don't do it then it won't be delivered properly. But actually we gained a lot from kind of handing over that responsibility and handing over that to other people, and other people gained a lot as well. And the feedback from young people on the session and within the leadership group was positive, with a high number finding the session enjoyable. The findings will be presented to the Board of Trustees before the end of the year, and they're looking forward to taking the information forward in order to shape the organisation's direction in the future. And I guess my contribution to this session was around actually generating interest in the use of beneficiaries and participants, not only as participants of the research, but also in the design and delivery of your research processes, and a really interesting, and I found a really successful way of doing that. Cheers.
I don't have any slides because I'm going to talk about this very briefly and try to keep everything anonymous, because this scenario that I'm going to present you with is an actual scenario, what happened in the worst case scenario, the worst case situation of possibly how not to do research. So, a while ago, a UK-wide bid went out for a project involving children and families. This went out nationally, and it looked for partners who would work with their local authority and voluntary sector organisations to work together to apply for this funding. It was aimed at areas of high need, areas of complex needs, areas of high poverty, and so obviously it was targeted at some very deprived wards across the UK. Now there was a number of bidding systems, as in most national bids, it goes through a number of processes. When it got to the final stage, it was left with 7 local authority areas. At that point, the UK funders said that they wanted to get a well-known national research organisation in to check that what the applicants were saying about how high need the areas are was actually true, to prove in their way that the areas the money would eventually go to were those in most high need. So they got a national research organisation in, who I won't say the name, but if anyone asks me I might release it, to do this research. Now this was research with children and families in poor areas with high crime rates, high drug rates, low education, education needs. In midwinter, doing doorstep surveys in multi-occupancy houses with children under a specific age, often single parent families, for 45 minutes.
On the doorstep?
On the doorstep. They didn't, this research, when it went out, none of the organisations knew it was taking place until afterwards, because it was supposed to be neutral. We weren't supposed to obviously affect that in any way. So we didn't know until afterwards that this national agency was going to all these individuals, all these tight-knit communities. So not only did that happen, you had a number of events that was linked to that. So one of them was that these high needs areas were, in some cases, areas that had a lot of contact with social services. And in one particular area, following a visit by a gentleman researcher to do a doorstep survey, the following day, a child got extracted from a family, and they connected this gentleman doing research with reporting on them and this child then being extracted from a family. That wasn't the case, by the way, but they connected that because they weren't, the communities weren't informed of what was going on. They just had this person cold calling on their doorstep. So they weren't involved in the process at all. The message went around social media. So this is important, to being aware when you're in communities of how much social media makes news travel. And from that point on, the following day, no one was answering any questions to anyone who came to the door. Not only that, they already had a difficulty because in that area there was actually a no cold calling campaign that had gone out, which was highly successful, by the way. So no one was already trying to answer the door. And then all this happened. And then what they decided to do, because the data that they did get was limited, they decided to go into local children's centres and do these 45-minute surveys in the middle of a children's centre. And it was questions to do with how literate your child is, have you had drugs during pregnancy, have you had alcohol during pregnancy, what's your reading rate of your child, can your child say the following things? A whole host of very, very personal questions. Now, I'm not a mother, but I imagine if I was, that my child would be up there. They would be Einstein. Even if they weren't, they would be Einstein. Because you're being asked that in an environment where there's posters on the wall about the dangers of drugs, the dangers of alcohol, the importance of breastfeeding, the importance of literacy, the importance of education. And so when the results got put in to the national organisation, basically it showed this local authority had not been telling the truth because we were great. That the literacy levels were up here. That there's no drug problem, there's no alcohol problem. Where have you got your data from and where have they got theirs from? Now, because we knew and because all the community came, because the third sector, or voluntary community sector, have relationships, and that's the important thing. That's one of the things that's been obviously highlighted through the different case studies and give different examples, is that it's that relationship building and that trust that when you're engaging with the community, the voluntary sector, it's that relationship that's important, and it's about knowing the bigger picture, knowing the campaigns that are going on in the background, knowing the politics is so big, knowing the politics that are surrounding that piece of research, knowing what else is going on in that community. You may not think at that time that it's relevant, but if you can get a bigger picture before you start doing your research, then you're better informed and you know who the key contacts are. Sometimes it might seem that you want to go from Manchester to Leeds. The quickest way is the motorway. The quickest way is, it might not be depending on the road, but you think the quickest way is from A to B. But research with voluntary and community organisations, the quickest way isn't always the best way, and the quickest way isn't the most valuable way. Often you have to go via D, E, F, G, all the way around to get to where you want to go, and you need to know all those connections, and it might take 2 years. It might mean that your research, you don't think it worked the right way, but actually you found out something useful for the next project. But it's about knowing all that and being really engaged and speaking to the people who work in the sector for 10 years, 12 years, 1 year, because connections seem to be the key in the voluntary sector. Thank you.